Have you ever wondered what it would look like if you made a tank with a realistic gear train and scrap mechanic? Neither had I, and you came to the wrong place. In all seriousness though, I had this idea to make a tank that was driven by a single engine as opposed to the four you normally need for tank steering, and I wanted to use the gears mod again because I had fun last time. It certainly didn't end up being the most efficient and was more than a little laggy, but it turned out pretty good for what I had. With that said, let's get into the build. After installing the mechanical parts in the Glitch Welder mod, I loaded into the world. I also got a tip from the comments that there's a collection of pre-built gears on the workshop other than the presentation, but I could not find that comment again. If that was you, let me know and I'll pin you. I started by flying out to the edge. Actually, this time I just went to a clearing in the middle of the map. The first thing I did was test which block palette I wanted to use. I liked how paintable plastic and concrete were, but they looked almost too green to be a tank. The metal 3 block looked fine, but the color was really hard to see unless you had the right lighting. It was also significantly heavier than plastic blocks, a personal favorite. I ended up just going with metal 3 because I wanted to make a decision fast. I built out a platform of the block and started trying to piece together something of a transmission. I wanted something that, when I pressed a button, would physically move gears around in order to reverse the output. I placed down these bevel gears because whatever I made I wanted it to be symmetrical, as both sides would have to have duplicated gearing. I messed around with a couple different ways to move the gears from here and temporarily settled for this Gear 1 to Gear 3 transition. This is also a good time to say that the small 1 block diameter gears I call Gear 1, and the 3 block diameter gears I will call Gear 3. The same thing applies for the beveled variants. I knew at some point I would need to put a piston down to move the gears around to change the output ratio, so I tried to put one behind this Gear 3 to see if it gave me any ideas. You can see that when I flip the switch the gear moves out of the way, but nothing more. That train of thought really wasn't going anywhere, so I removed that gear and just made it stationary. I then tried to make the next gear in line actuate, starting with this Gear 1 and eventually putting this Gear 3 directly over top of it. I don't really know what the goal with that was. I think that I thought if one was more powerful than the other, I could have one of them activated at a time, but unsurprisingly they just fought each other and didn't do much else. After thinking about it for a bit longer, I decided that on a piston there should be a two-sided Gear 3. Two-sided just means that it takes up a full block instead of a quarter block, and it looks like two gears floating next to each other. This gear is nice because I can actually build on both sides of it. I also had to make this gear a little thicker so it would align with the input properly, so I welded a Gear 3 with a shaft onto it. With all of that together, you can see kind of what I was going for. With the piston off, the gear spins, and with the piston on, the gear also spins. That seems redundant, but is actually exactly what I wanted. To use this correctly, I placed 2 pipe pieces on the face of the gear, and then welded another 2-sided gear with pipes directly opposite it. With this, you can see what I was actually going for. With the piston deactivated, it rotates against the wall, but when the piston is activated, the pipes engage on the opposite side, and that gear begins to rotate. This effectively allows me to have 2 completely separate gear trains that can both lead to one output. In hindsight, I can think of much easier ways to do this, and even before I finished recording, I thought of better ways. But I love the way this works, and the way you can see the coupling physically, so I was determined to keep it. I'm all about form over function. With that, all I had to do was run an odd number of gears on one side and an even number on the other side to reverse the direction. That is much easier said than done on such a limited build grid, and this was before I ran into too many issues. I will absolutely come back to why this gave me such a headache. Cool, so right now, tires rotating forward. If I flip that switch, tires rotating backward. That seemed to be successful, so I wanted to test with what I had. I added another tire on the other side, removed a whole bunch of excess blocks, and gave it a front tire and put it to work. After fixing a few minor issues, it worked pretty well. How is that? I don't know. And I don't think I care. I did have to chase it a few times, and then put a seat on it, which I had to chase, and then it took me 10 minutes to remember that changing the camera mode is bound to control. Then I chased it again through these bushes and into this crater, but it did work. I also at some point in here pressed the Windows key and somehow switched my keyboard into the French layout, meaning I couldn't walk forward for a little while, but it did work. Why can't I move? I cannot move forward for some reason. With that proof of concept working, I saved it on my lift, deleted it out of the world, and then I couldn't build it anymore because of a joint error. If you look at the blueprint on the lift, you can see this random bearing, and that's what was causing the error. What is this? This meant I wouldn't be able to build this creation ever again, which sounds bad and it was annoying, but this was just a proof of concept, so it could have been much worse. I moved on to working on the final tank design, which I tried to model after a real tank. I slanted both sides and then threw on some wheels to make sure it wasn't too heavy. I noticed that most tanks' wheelbases are kind of inset, so I tried to replicate that by pushing this into the floor. After spending too long trying to get it to look right, I placed the bearings about where I wanted them and where the wheels should go. Now, you probably noticed in the intro that the final design doesn't look exactly like a tank. You'll see why exactly that is shortly, but I tried to remedy that now by figuring out how to do tank tracks. I went into this not expecting to make actual tank tracks because a single track can use upwards of 15 bearings, and in Scrap Mechanic, lag is pretty much directly correlated with the number of bearings. Despite that, I figured to make it look a little more realistic, I would at least give it a try. The first thing I tried was to use some Gear 3s with these chains of rat gears, hoping that they would at least kind of mesh and work. You can see that no matter what I tried, I could not get these to weld on. I could have forced it to work, but it would have been more trouble than it was worth, so I just gave up. Next, I tried the more traditional wheel-based track design. I placed down some wheels, surrounding them by this block bearing chain, and tested that. You can see that once I detached the chain, it worked pretty well, and it acted pretty much as you would expect a track to. I still wasn't sure if I would do tracks in the final design, but I wanted to at least leave it as an option, so I made some additional space around my wheels by dropping them down by a block. I also noticed that my tank was currently an even width, and if I wanted to have a centralized and symmetrical system, it would need to be odd. I fixed that by just cutting it in half and welding it right back together, effectively removing a block from the middle. I then tried to take the gears on the wheels upwards so I could interface with them a little easier. I also hooked up an engine to test them. I noticed one wheel wasn't rotating, so I put it on the lift and it actually stayed in place. I have no idea how, but it must have become detached at some point in the process. This is when something that is just new levels of dumb Scrap Mechanic happened. I'm gonna slow this down and just let you see it first. In the moment, I thought I just messed up somehow, and I was fully prepared to write this script blaming myself. If you watch carefully though, what actually happened is I went to pick up the obviously detached wheel on the lift. Upon picking up this wheel that is actively rolling away from me, the game instead decided that it once again is a part of the tank and put that on my lift instead. I have so much muscle memory for deleting things that I did this all too fast to realize what happened, and I was suddenly without a tank. And of course, I hadn't saved it yet. In reality, that wasn't too much work lost, but after everything earlier, it was discouraging enough that I decided from here I would just build a box instead of making it look like a tank. Anyway, from here I set to rebuilding that still broken transmission mechanism. This required a lot of looking at the blueprint and trying to make it fit into a new body. I spent a while trying to modify it to make it smaller, including using this flat gear instead of the two-sided gear with pipes, and although I love the way this gear looks, none of them quite worked as well. I pretty much ended off with exactly the same mechanism I had before the joint error. I put the transmission toward the front of the vehicle and used this big gear train to bring the output to the wheels. I also reinforced every gear by putting a bearing opposite them. This had a substantial improvement on stability, but also increased lag. Right here is where I noticed the issue with that flat gear. The way it pushed up against it means that it was offset slightly and the teeth weren't really meshing properly, leading to this jittering motion. I didn't fix it yet though, instead I tried everything possible to save this gear even though it was absolutely more difficult. The lag from the big gear train was pretty bad, so I cut it down as much as possible by removing the transmission and welding it directly above the wheels. I also noticed that I would need a little more space inside, so I again cut the vehicle in half, added some blocks, and re-welded it. I made some minor changes so that I could reinforce more gears, and then finally decided that I would just go back to the original design for the coupling mechanism, meaning I would need even more space. This time, after cutting the vehicle in half, I decided that I would not weld it back together until I knew how much space I needed. Some minor changes later, I realized that I had a pretty big slipping issue and tracked it down to right here. The Gear 1s have so little surface area that they're very prone to slipping, and as you can see here, under a load, they don't even stay centered on their bearing. This kicked off what turned into the longest single part of this entire build process. How do I get one side to have reversed motion without using any Gear 1s? I tried probably 20 or 30 things over the next hour and a half. It was a lot of me saying, oh, hold on, wait. I just had a thought. Because I kept finding new ways to solve the wrong problem. And here is the solution I ended on. If that looks familiar, it's because it is exactly the same thing I started with. All I did was support the other side of the gear. An hour and a half just to support a gear. But then again, would this really be an Oxinity video without spending hours on useless things? At least I learned a lot from it. With that working, this is pretty much the whole gear portion done. I noticed that it was pretty much symmetrical vertically, so I could just duplicate it and flip it to get the other side of the tank. After what happened earlier, I was incredibly suspicious about saving stuff on the lift, and I noticed that this creation said it had 30 bearings when I was only counting 16. It turns out my fears were warranted yet again, because joint error. I still have no clue what causes this, but I wasn't going to let it stop me this time. I did not want to rebuild this again. I didn't even know where to start, so a massive thanks to Tomatsu's video where he uses a blueprint editor to fix this issue. He turned this from easily an hour into only 15 minutes. If you want to know more details, check out his video, I won't go over them here. Basically though, there ended up being some floating bearings, and Scrap Mechanic doesn't let a creation spawn in like that, so I had to remove them. That issue resolved, the rest is pretty simple. I built out 2 mirrored halves of the lower vehicle that I could weld a transmission onto, and then welded the halves together. I welded the transmission onto one side, followed by the other side with some minor modifications so they would take up slightly less space. That was followed by realizing that I had done it again and the vehicle was an even width. Oh, it is an even width. Oh my lord. Something I noted through gritted teeth. After fixing that again, I reattached the left side of the transmission and the mechanical parts were all in place. I added some front wheels and gave it a test. I also decided that the tracks were a no-go because I was already dropping to below 60 FPS and it was only getting worse. From here on out, all I did was add cosmetics, an AD converter to reverse the correct side for turning, a super simple turret, a WS converter to control the turret, and some simple logic so that you only move the turret when you're stationary. It's quite simple, really. And that's pretty much the entire creation. So for FPS reasons, here is slightly sped up footage of me driving it around. And some shooting. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and feel free to subscribe. If you're interested in another video like this, you can click the card on the screen or check out my channel. This tank is pretty simple on the surface, but it took me so long to build and I had so many issues that I thought it would make a good video. Watching the transmission in action is super cool too, and the fact that I made tank steering with only one engine is pretty unique. Also, if you'd like, you can check the description for a workshop link. I may or may not remember to put it there. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.